On the morning of October 17th, 1897, a dairy farmer named William Hutchins arrived at the Cumberland Valley Children's Home in Ashland County, Tennessee, to deliver his weekly supply of milk and butter. He found the front gate standing open. The main building, a 2-story structure of whitewashed clapboard, showed no signs of activity. Hutchins called out. No response came. He walked to the kitchen entrance, knocked, and receiving no answer, pushed the door inward. The kitchen was cold. The stove had been banked but not relit. Breakfast preparations had not begun. Hutchins proceeded through the building, calling as he went. The refectory was empty. The dormitories were empty. The beds were made with military precision, as they always were, but no children occupied them. He climbed to the second floor and found the same silence, order, and absence. 33 children, ranging in age from 4 to 15, had vanished. The staff, consisting of the orphanage's founder and director, Reverend Josiah Carver, along with 2 matrons and a groundskeeper, had vanished as well. Hutchins returned to his wagon and drove immediately to Ashland, the county seat, some 7 miles distant. By noon, the county sheriff, a man named Robert Massey, had assembled a group of deputies and concerned citizens. They rode to the orphanage in the cold autumn sunlight. What they found there would occupy investigators, journalists, and legal authorities for the remainder of that year and well into the next. But it would never produce a satisfactory answer. The case came to be known in official documentation as the Cumberland Valley Incident. In local memory, it was called simply the disappearance. And in the scattered records that survive court transcripts, asylum reports, newspaper fragments, it stands as one of the most thoroughly investigated and least understood events in Tennessee's post-war history. The Cumberland Valley Children's Home had been founded in 1889 by Reverend Josiah Carver, a minister of the Cumberland Presbyterian Church. Carver had served as a chaplain during the war's final year, ministering to wounded soldiers in field hospitals throughout the Western Theater. The experience had marked him profoundly. Those who knew him before and after the war remarked on the change, how a man of considerable warmth and humor had become grave and contemplative, given to long silences and sudden pronouncements about divine providence and human suffering. After the war, Carver declined several offers of established pastorates. Instead, he traveled throughout the Cumberland region, preaching at camp meetings in small churches, living on donations and the hospitality of rural congregations. He witnessed, in those travels, the aftermath of social dissolution, the orphaned children of dead soldiers, the abandoned offspring of families shattered by economic collapse, the unwanted progeny of unmarried women who had no means of support. The war had killed fathers. The peace that followed had killed hope. And the children accumulated in poorhouses, county farms, and informal arrangements that amounted to indentured servitude. In 1888, Carver petitioned the Cumberland Presbyterian Synod for permission to establish a home for such children. He proposed a self-sustaining institution children would be fed, clothed, educated, and trained in practical trades. Older children would work the home's farm and workshops, contributing to the institution's upkeep. Religious instruction would be rigorous and daily. The goal was not merely to warehouse orphans, but to transform them into productive, God-fearing citizens who would carry the values of discipline and faith into the new century. The Synod approved the plan with modest financial support. Carver located a suitable property, 40 acres of farmland in Ashland County, with an existing farmhouse that could be expanded and outfitted. Local craftsmen, many of them war veterans who remembered Carver's ministry, contributed labor at reduced rates. By spring of 1889, the Cumberland Valley Children's Home opened with 12 residents. Within 3 years, that number had grown to 33. The home operated with remarkable efficiency. Carver maintained strict schedules, rising at 5, morning prayers at 5:30, breakfast at 6, followed by chores, lessons, and work rotations. Older boys worked the fields and tended livestock. Older girls managed the kitchen, laundry, and mending. Younger children attended lessons taught by Carver himself, focusing on reading, arithmetic, scripture memorization, and penmanship. Evenings concluded with collective prayer and hymn singing. Lights were extinguished at 8. The routine never varied. Visitors to the home remarked on the children's discipline and cleanliness. They were thin but not malnourished. They were quiet but not sullen. They addressed adults as sir and ma'am. They moved in orderly lines. They sang hymns with genuine fervor. The home became, in the eyes of the Cumberland Presbyterian community, a model of what Christian charity could accomplish, proof that even the most unfortunate children could be redeemed through structure, labor, and faith. But there were aspects of the home that troubled some observers. The isolation, for instance. The property was situated 3 miles from the nearest neighbor, accessible only by a rough wagon track that became impassable in heavy rain. The children rarely left the grounds. There were no visits to town, no social interactions with the wider community. Carver explained that such isolation was necessary. The children had come from environments of chaos and vice, and required separation from worldly temptations in order to be properly reformed. There was also the matter of discipline. Several children who had been removed from the home by relatives reported harsh punishments for minor infractions, extended periods of isolation in a root cellar beneath the main building, reduction of food rations, hours spent kneeling on stone floors in enforced prayer. Carver defended these methods as necessary corrections, no different from what any responsible parent might employ. The Synod, investigating complaints in 1895, found no evidence of abuse severe enough to warrant intervention. The home continued its operations without interruption, and there was Carver himself. His sermons, delivered each Sunday to the assembled children, had grown increasingly apocalyptic in tone. He spoke of the last days. He spoke of the cleansing fire that will consume the wicked. He spoke of the necessity of absolute purity, of total submission to divine will, of the certainty that the world was rushing toward judgment. Several of the home's neighbors, attending Sunday services out of curiosity or concern, left disturbed by what they had heard. But disturbed was not the same as alarmed. Carver was a minister, after all. Ministers spoke of damnation and salvation. That was their function. The final week of the Cumberland Valley Children's Home began unremarkably. The autumn harvest was in progress. Older boys worked from dawn to dusk, gathering corn, digging potatoes, cutting firewood for winter. The weather held clear and cold. Carver's daily routine proceeded without variation. The matrons, Mrs. Sarah Dunning, a widow of 52, and Miss Harriet Cole, a spinster of 38, maintained their usual supervision of domestic work. The groundskeeper, a man named Thomas Beck, who lived in a small cottage at the property's edge, tended livestock and performed repairs. On October 13th, Carver made his weekly trip to Ashland to purchase supplies and collect mail. The general store proprietor, a man named Arthur Sims, later testified that Carver seemed distracted but not agitated. He purchased the usual items: flour, salt, lamp oil, paper. He mentioned that he was preparing a special sermon for the following Sunday. Sims asked the subject. Carver replied that it concerned the parable of the wise and foolish virgins, the necessity of being prepared for the bridegroom's arrival, regardless of the hour. On October 14th, a traveling salesman stopped at the home seeking permission to water his horse. He was met at the gate by Thomas Beck, who informed him that visitors were not permitted without prior arrangement. The salesman noted that he could hear children singing inside the main building a hymn he did not recognize, in a minor key, repeated over and over. Beck provided water and sent the salesman on his way. On October 15th, nothing unusual was reported. The home was visible from a distant ridge to anyone passing on the main road to Ashland. Several travelers noted smoke rising from the chimneys. The farm appeared to be operating normally. On October 16th, a neighbor named Ezra Littleton, whose property bordered the orphanage land, was hunting in the woods near the boundary. At approximately 9 in the evening, he heard singing coming from the direction of the home. This was unusual. Lights were typically extinguished by 8, and no activities occurred after evening prayers. Littleton did not investigate. He assumed some special observance was taking place, but he mentioned it later to his wife, who remembered the conversation after the disappearance became known. The singing, Littleton stated, had been high-pitched and strange. Not hymns, exactly, but something that sounded like hymns with the melody altered. It had continued for perhaps 20 minutes, then stopped abruptly. Afterward, silence. No voices. No sounds of children being put to bed. Only the wind in the trees and the distant cry of an owl. That was the last anyone heard from the Cumberland Valley Children's Home. By the following morning, it was empty. Sheriff Massey's initial search of the property revealed an environment of perfect order. Beds were made, dishes were washed and stacked, floors were swept. The children's few possessions, clothing, Bibles, simple toys, remained in their designated places. The kitchen pantry was well stocked. The livestock had been fed and watered, though they showed signs of distress from being unattended since the previous evening. Nothing appeared to have been taken. Nothing appeared to have been disturbed. The only anomaly was in the chapel, a room on the first floor of the main building that had been converted for religious services. The benches where children normally sat had been pushed against the walls. The floor had been scrubbed recently. The boards were still damp. On the simple wooden pulpit, Massey found a Bible open to the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 25, verses 1 through 13. The passage concerned the parable of the 10 virgins, 5 wise, 5 foolish, waiting for the bridegroom. When he arrives at midnight, the foolish virgins who brought no oil for their lamps are locked out of the wedding feast. The verse was underlined in heavy ink. Watch therefore, for ye know neither the day nor the hour wherein the Son of Man cometh. Massey organized an immediate search of the surrounding countryside. 30 men on horseback and on foot combed the woods, fields, and creek bottoms within a 5-mile radius of the home. They found nothing. No tracks, no abandoned clothing, no signs of passage through the dense undergrowth. The only path leading from the property was the main wagon track to the road, and travelers on that road the previous day reported seeing no one. The search expanded. Telegraph messages were sent to neighboring counties. Descriptions of the missing children, 33 of them, including names, ages, and identifying features, were distributed to sheriffs, railroad agents, and postmasters throughout eastern Tennessee. Inquiries were made at every orphanage, poorhouse, and children's institution within a 100-mile radius. No one had seen them. No one had heard anything. Massey interrogated the neighbors. Ezra Littleton described the strange singing. Other families mentioned that they had noticed less activity at the home in recent weeks. Fewer children visible in the fields, less noise of play or work. But the property was isolated, and people minded their own affairs. No one had thought to investigate. The sheriff's attention turned to Reverend Carver's background. Inquiries to the Cumberland Presbyterian Synod revealed that Carver had been a competent but unremarkable minister until the war. His service as a chaplain had been exemplary, though fellow chaplains noted that he spent much of his time in solitary prayer rather than socializing with other officers. After the war, he had become increasingly withdrawn and focused on themes of judgment and purification. The Synod had considered him eccentric, but harmless, a man scarred by what he had witnessed, channeling his pain into work with unfortunate children. Examination of Carver's papers, found in his office at the home, revealed extensive theological writings. Page after page of dense, minute script, parsing scripture for evidence of Christ's imminent return. Calculations based on biblical chronology, attempting to determine the year, month, and day of the second coming. Meditations on the necessity of absolute faith, absolute purity, absolute readiness, and recurring references to the idea of being taken up. The righteous lifted bodily to heaven, while the wicked remained to face tribulation. In his desk, investigators found a final document dated October 16, 1897. It was titled, Final Instruction. The text was brief. We have waited. We have prepared. The appointed hour approaches. Those who are ready will be received. Those who are worthy will be transformed. We go now to meet the bridegroom. Let no one follow. Let no one mourn. What we do in obedience to the command that has been given. The children are innocent. They have been made pure. They will inherit what has been promised. I have been faithful to the trust given me. When you read this, we will have gone beyond the reach of earthly authority. Do not search for us. You will not find us unless it is God's will. The document was not signed, but the handwriting matched Carver's other writings. 3 weeks after the disappearance, a girl was found walking along a railroad track 40 miles south of Ashland. She was approximately 12 years old, thin and filthy, wearing a torn dress that had once been the standard gray smock issued to residents of the Cumberland Valley Children's Home. She carried no possessions. She was suffering from exposure and dehydration. She was taken to a local doctor, who provided care and notified authorities. The girl gave her name as Alice Brennan. She had been a resident of the home for 4 years, having been placed there after her mother's death from typhoid. Under careful questioning by Sheriff Massey and a court-appointed guardian, she provided a fragmented account of what had occurred on October 16th. Alice's testimony, recorded in a deposition dated November 8, 1897, was halting and confused. She appeared terrified of providing details. She repeatedly stated that she had broken her promise and that the Reverend would be displeased. But gradually, with patient questioning, a narrative emerged. On the evening of October 16th, after the usual evening meal and prayers, Reverend Carver had summoned all residents to the chapel. This was unusual, but not unprecedented. Special services were occasionally held for instruction or discipline. The children assembled. The matrons stood at the back of the room. Thomas Beck, the groundskeeper, stood near the door. Carver began to preach. His sermon, according to Alice, was not like his usual sermons. He spoke quietly, almost gently. He told the children that they were chosen, that they had been brought to the home not by chance, but by divine selection, that they had been prepared through discipline and devotion for a great purpose, that they were about to receive the reward for their faithfulness. He spoke of the parable of the virgins. He explained that the bridegroom, Christ, was coming at midnight, that those who were ready would be taken up to meet him. that they would be transformed, freed from earthly bodies, made into beings of light and glory, that they would never again know hunger, cold, pain, or fear. But preparation was required. They must be pure. They must be absolutely clean. They must empty themselves of all earthly attachments. Carver instructed the children to remove their shoes and stockings, to wash their feet in basins that had been prepared, to put on clean white garments that had been laid out for them. The children obeyed. Alice stated that there was no resistance. They had been trained to obey without question, and Carver's tone was so calm, so certain, that none thought to refuse. The matrons and Thomas Beck assisted with the washing and dressing. The process took perhaps an hour. When all were prepared, Carver led them in prayer. They knelt on the chapel floor. They recited psalms together. They sang hymns, the strange hymns that Ezra Littleton had heard from the woods. And then Carver told them to lie down, to close their eyes, to breathe slowly, to prepare themselves to be lifted up. Alice stated that she had lain down with the others, that she had closed her eyes and waited, that she had heard Carver moving among them, speaking softly, that she had begun to feel strange, dizzy, and cold, as if she were sinking into the floor, that she had heard other children beginning to cry softly, and Carver's voice telling them not to be afraid, that the transformation was beginning. And then she had opened her eyes. She could not explain why. She stated that something had told her to look. When she opened her eyes, she saw Carver standing over one of the younger children, holding something in his hands. A cloth. He was placing it over the child's face. The child was not moving. Alice sat up. Carver saw her. He did not speak. He only looked at her with what she described as terrible sadness. And then she ran. She scrambled to her feet and ran from the chapel, through the darkened building, out the front door, across the yard, into the woods. She heard shouting behind her, Carver's voice calling her name, telling her to come back, that she was not ready, that she would be lost. But she ran deeper into the forest, blind with terror, stumbling through undergrowth, falling and rising and running again. She did not stop until dawn. By then, she was miles from the home, lost in country she did not recognize. She walked for days, hiding from people, eating what she could find or steal, following the railroad tracks south because she thought they might lead somewhere safe. When she was found, she had traveled 40 miles on foot. She weighed 63 pounds. Alice Brennan's testimony provoked immediate action. Sheriff Massey returned to the Cumberland Valley Children's Home with a larger force, deputies, a county coroner, and 2 doctors. They conducted a systematic search of the entire property, including structures and grounds that had been examined only cursorily during the initial investigation. They found the root cellar. It was located beneath the kitchen, accessible through a trapdoor that had been concealed under a heavy storage cabinet. The cabinet required 6 men to move. The cellar itself was approximately 12 feet square, with a ceiling height of 6 feet. It was damp and dark, ventilated only by a narrow pipe leading to the surface. The walls were stone. The floor was hard-packed earth. The bodies of 33 children were arranged in the cellar in neat rows. They lay on their backs, hands folded across their chests. They wore clean white garments. Their eyes were closed. They appeared, at first glance, to be sleeping. But they were not sleeping. Subsequent medical examination, conducted over 3 days by Dr. Harrison Webb of Nashville, determined that all had died of asphyxiation. Most showed evidence of chloroform exposure, traces of the chemical on their faces and in their lungs. Several of the older children showed signs of struggle, bruising, torn fingernails. but most appeared to have succumbed without resistance. The bodies were in various states of decomposition, but all were consistent with death occurring on or about October 16th. They had been carefully arranged. Their hair had been combed. Their faces had been washed. Sprigs of dried lavender had been placed in their folded hands. Also found in the cellar were the bodies of Mrs. Sarah Dunning and Miss Harriet Cole, the two matrons. They lay at the end of the rows, similarly positioned, similarly clothed. Medical examination suggested they had died in the same manner as the children, though whether by their own hands or carvers could not be determined. Thomas Bagg, the groundskeeper, was found in his cottage. He had died from a single gunshot wound to the head. A pistol lay beside him. A note, written in shaky script, stated, "I helped him. God forgive me. I could not go with them." Reverend Josiah Carver was never found. The hunt for Josiah Carver became one of the most extensive manhunts in Tennessee history. His description was circulated throughout the South and beyond. 56 years old, 6 feet tall, lean build, gray hair and beard, dark eyes, typically dressed in black ministerial clothing. Rewards were offered. Sightings were reported from Kentucky to Louisiana, from Virginia to Arkansas. All proved false. Railroad agents were questioned. No one matching Carver's description had purchased tickets. Riverboat captains were interviewed. No such passenger had been seen. Roads were watched. Wagon traffic was monitored. Telegraph operators were instructed to report any suspicious inquiries. Nothing yielded results. The possibility was considered that Carver had died on the property, and his body had not been found. The entire 40 acres were searched by teams moving in grid patterns. Dogs were brought in. Wells and ditches were probed. The forest surrounding the property was combed by volunteers. No body was discovered. No grave was found. Some believed he had fled to the frontier territories, Oklahoma, New Mexico, places where a man could vanish into vastness. Others believed he had assumed a new identity, shaved his beard, changed his manner of dress, and merged into some distant city where no one knew his face. Still others believed he had taken his own life in some remote location, and that his bones lay undiscovered in a ravine or cave. But many in Ashland County believed something else. They believed that Carver had gone into the woods that night and simply walked until he could walk no more, that he had sat down against a tree or lain down in a creek bed and waited for the exposure and starvation that would come, that his death was his final act of penance, not for what he had done to the children, which he believed was salvation, but for his failure to achieve his own transformation. He had prepared others for ascension, but had been left behind himself. And so he had removed himself from the world quietly, deliberately, as a man who no longer had purpose. The Cumberland Valley Children's Home was burned to the ground in December of 1897 by order of the county court. The structure was deemed too contaminated by grief to be salvaged or repurposed. The land was auctioned and eventually absorbed into neighboring farms. The cemetery where the 33 children were buried in a mass grave with a single shared monument became a small, fenced plot maintained by the county. Fresh flowers appear there still, though no one claims responsibility for placing them. Alice Brennan was placed with a family in Nashville. She lived to adulthood, married, and bore 3 children. She never spoke publicly about the events at the home. When asked, even by her own family, she would state only that she had been fortunate, that God had given her a moment of clarity, that she did not understand why she had been spared when others had not. She died in 1941, at the age of 56, the same age Carver had been at the time of the disappearance. The Cumberland Presbyterian Church conducted its own inquiry, which concluded that Carver had suffered a complete mental collapse brought on by trauma from his war experiences, isolation, and the weight of theological obsessions that had calcified into delusion. The church issued a formal apology to the families of the victims and established a fund for memorial purposes. The case was cited in subsequent decades as evidence of the dangers of religious extremism unchecked by community oversight. But the questions remained. How had Carver convinced the matrons to participate? Had they truly believed they were facilitating salvation, or had they been coerced? The note left by Thomas Beck suggested guilt, but not the nature of his involvement. Had he helped willingly or under threat? And had there been signs that authorities should have recognized earlier warnings in Carver's behavior or theology that might have prevented the tragedy? Dr. Webb, the physician who examined the bodies, was interviewed extensively by journalists and church officials. He stated that the children showed evidence of systematic sedation, overtime malnutrition, consistent with reduced rations, physical weakness suggesting prolonged fatigue. Carver, he believed, had been preparing them slowly, weakening their resistance, making them more susceptible to whatever he administered on the final night. It was not a sudden act of madness, but a methodical process carried out over weeks or months. The most disturbing aspect, Webb noted, was the care with which the bodies had been arranged. Someone, Carver, presumably, with Beck's assistance, had spent hours in that cellar, positioning each child, cleaning them, dressing them, making them presentable. It suggested that Carver genuinely believed he was preparing them for resurrection, that when Christ returned, they would rise from that cellar transformed and glorified, that his work had been an act not of murder, but of mercy. The parable of the 10 virgins, which Carver had underlined in his Bible and preached in his final sermon, is a story about waiting. 5 virgins bring enough oil for their lamps and are admitted to the wedding feast. 5 do not, and when they go to buy more, they return to find the door locked. The bridegroom has come. The feast has begun. They are too late. But the parable does not address what happens when the bridegroom does not come at all. What happens when the waiting extends beyond midnight, beyond dawn, beyond reason? What happens when faith becomes untethered from reality and transforms into something that demands sacrifice rather than patience? Josiah Carver waited his entire life for transformation, for the world to be made right, for suffering to be redeemed, for the promise of glory to be fulfilled. He waited through war, through loss, through the slow dissolution of the society he had known. And when transformation did not come, he attempted to create it himself. He gathered the most innocent, the most vulnerable, and he prepared them for an ascension that existed only in his increasingly fractured mind. The children trusted him. They had been taught to trust authority, to obey without question, to believe that suffering in this world would be rewarded in the next. And so when he told them to lie down, to close their eyes, to prepare for glory, they did, all but one. Alice Brennan's survival was called miraculous by some, fortunate by others. But perhaps it was simply this, a moment when obedience faltered, when training failed, when some instinct older than faith told her to open her eyes and look. And in looking, she saw not transformation, but death, not salvation, but murder, dressed in religious language. The land where the home stood is quiet now. The forest has reclaimed it. The fields have gone to seed and been reabsorbed by trees. The wagon track has become impassable, erased by time and weather. Only the cemetery remains accessible, a small plot beside a county road, enclosed by iron fencing, marked by a single stone that lists 33 names and a single date. Visitors to the site occasionally report an odd sensation, a feeling of being watched, or a sound like distant singing carried on the wind. But these are likely nothing more than the mind's tendency to impose meaning on silence, to hear voices in the rustling of leaves. The dead do not sing. They do not wait. They do not rise on command, no matter how fervent the faith of those who buried them. And Josiah Carver, wherever he went, whoever he became, or however he ended, he took with him the certainty that had destroyed so many. He carried it into whatever darkness received him. And the children he left in that cellar, arranged in neat rows, hands folded, dressed for a feast they would never attend. They remained as he had placed them, waiting for a bridegroom who never came and never would. Thus concluded the investigation into what the Cumberland Presbyterian Church termed the Cumberland Valley Tragedy, a case that revealed not the sudden eruption of madness, but its slow accumulation over years, sanctified by theology, enabled by isolation, and consummated in a midnight ritual that transformed faith into its most terrible opposite, the certainty that killing could be mistaken for deliverance, and that murder, performed with sufficient conviction, could be mistaken for grace. Asterisk.